Welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I began the discussion of roles of the presidency by talking primarily about the chief of state role, the ceremonial role that the president plays, and the chief executive function, essentially overseeing a vast federal bureaucracy. I also touched a little bit on budgeting, which I don't have listed under the five roles of the presidency, but is one that I certainly would add if I were going to add to my list. Today I want to talk primarily, although not exclusively, about the two roles the president plays in the foreign policy arena. And you may remember in the discussion earlier, I told you that traditionally presidents are far more powerful, far stronger when playing the foreign policy role. That was Wildowski's thesis, remember, that the president is stronger in foreign policy than domestic policy. In this third role, the commander in chief role, what the Constitution says and what usually happens are two very, very different things. First of all, keep in mind that the founding fathers made the assumption that George Washington was going to be president. And the founding fathers actually thought that if the United States were involved in another war, say with England, or who knows, maybe the French or a European power, that George Washington might actually lead troops in battle. Today, the idea of Donald Trump getting on an attack helicopter and going after the bad guy seems pretty ridiculous, but the idea of George Washington leading troops in battle certainly was not only not far-fetched, but he was the only person alive at the time who was probably best suited for that role. What I want you to keep in mind today is this concept that's very important: civilian supremacy over the military. And sometimes presidents and their military commanders get along quite well, and sometimes they don't. I'll tell you two quick stories. One where the president and the the president and the military commander did it right, and one where the president did it right and the military commander did it wrong. So let me tell you that one first. During the Korean War, Harry Truman was the president, and the civilian, why do I keep saying civilian? The military commander was Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur kept making comments that irritated Truman, like he might press the North Koreans into China if they were to withdraw into China. And Truman said, no, you're not going to do that. You are not going to press this war into China and expand this war. And MacArthur, in essence, said, we'll see. On another occasion, MacArthur said that perhaps I will use tactical battlefield nuclear devices. And President Truman said, no, that's a decision I, as the president, make. And I've made that decision before. And under no circumstances are you going to use nuclear devices. And once again, General MacArthur undermined the president by saying, well, we'll see, I'll use my judgment. And Truman did something unthinkable. He fired General MacArthur. General MacArthur came home to ticker tape parades. There were newspaper editorials saying that General MacArthur has forgotten more things about the military than Truman will ever know. And essentially, everyone was backing General MacArthur. But in my mind, President Truman is the hero here. He reasserted this key concept of civilian supremacy over the military, that it is the president who has the last word, and that the job of military commanders is to fulfill the orders of the president. Now, let me fast forward a few decades. We have a president, George Bush Sr., and a military commander, Norman Schwarzkopf. It's during the first war with Iraq. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's leader, had invaded Kuwait. And George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, had put together a significant international coalition opposed to Saddam Hussein. And George H.W. Bush told his coalition partners that this war will end when we've liberated Kuwait and when Saddam Hussein surrenders and says that we're done fighting. Kuwait was liberated far more quickly than the experts, and I frankly will admit the war went far better than I expected it would go. And so Saddam Hussein essentially said, we surrender. So George H.W. Bush called up Norman Schwarzkopf and said, end the offensive. In this case, Saddam Hussein has said that he surrenders. And Norman Schwarzkopf said, Mr. President, this is a mistake. Give me another 24 to 48 hours at the rate that we're destroying their armored columns, in this case, their tank units. If you give me 48 more hours, Saddam Hussein will not be a threat to his neighbors for at least a decade. If we cease this offensive now, he's going to be able to remass his forces, and he is going to pose a serious obstacle in the future. And so George H.W. Bush said, I've given my word. There are political and diplomatic issues here. And once again, General Schwarzkopf said, Mr. President, I think this is a mistake. I believe that you should not end this offensive, but, and this is the most important part, but I work for you. And if you say that I need to end this offensive, I will obey your order. And Bush said, well, the order has been given, cease the offensive. And Schwarzkopf did. And a lot of people in hindsight would say, well, Schwarzkopf was right and Bush was wrong. But the point is that both President Bush and General Schwarzkopf understood this crucial concept of civilian supremacy over the military. Now, if you take a look at the Constitution, it appears that war making is a shared power. Constitutionally, it is Congress that declares war. And the president was then expected as commander-in-chief to go out and execute or carry out that war. Now, as your notes point out, in reality, this happens occasionally, right? It happened in World War I. It happened in World War II. It happened in the Mexican-American War. It happened in the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War. It's happened a handful of times. But in reality, what almost always happens is the president engages in the use of force abroad without a declaration of war. And in your notes, I stole some data from the congressional record. During the Vietnam War, Congress believed that both Presidents Johnson and President Nixon were renegade presidents, that they were engaged in war making that was very different than their predecessors. And so Congress had a study commission to look into presidential war making. And the results were absolutely shocking to the Congress people involved. They found that on 198 occasions, the president had engaged in the use of force abroad without a declaration of war 198 times from the year 1798 to 1972. And as a result of that, Congress decided that we need to reassert our traditional war-making powers. And so the result of that study was that in 1972, maybe it was 1973, the Congress passed this notion, this war powers resolution, to reassert its war-making powers. Now, in reality, I do not believe that the war powers resolution has restored a lot more power to Congress in war making. I do think that Congress is much better informed. They get more information. They get more information quickly. But the point is that when the president engages in the use of force abroad, it is very, very difficult for Congress to counter that because of that phenomenon that I talked about earlier, that rally around the flag phenomenon, where people tend to rally around a president who's involved in a foreign policy crisis. The fourth role that's in your notes is the chief diplomat's role, and there are two roles here that you need to know. First, once again, it appears that there is a shared power. Treaties are made with the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, advice and consent are two very different things. When you're seeking someone's advice, right, it's what do you think? You can take it or leave it. Consent means you have to have that. Once in a while, presidents go out and get advice when conducting a treaty. A good example of this would be Jimmy Carter with the Panama Canal Treaty. But usually presidents and their people go out and negotiate treaties, and they ask the Senate, in essence, to take it or leave it. And if you look at the history of treaty making, and I don't have this in the notes, and your book doesn't mention this, but about 99% of all treaties that have been submitted to the Senate have been approved. Now that number is slightly misleading because that does not include treaties that were withdrawn by the president because the president thought they might fail. But the point is that the Senate usually does not resist the president. There is a very historical and noteworthy exception. The Senate refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, ending World War I, and it was probably Woodrow Wilson's biggest political defeat while he was president. The second power as chief diplomat that I want you to know is that presidents have the power to recognize foreign nations. And your textbook does an excellent job, gives you two examples. I'll review the two because they're the two that I actually would have used in class even if I weren't using this textbook. There was a Russian revolution, a Bolshevik revolution, in which the communists came to power, eventually creating a new country, the Soviet Union. 4 American presidents refused to recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate country. One was a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, but then there were 3 Democrats, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. 16 years went by, and for 16 years the United States refused to extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. One of the first things that Franklin Roosevelt did when he became president in 1933 was he extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. Once again, this is a power that presidents have, and they do not need congressional authorization. Congress does not need to approve this choice. This is a power that the presidents exercise unilaterally. So Franklin Roosevelt did something that 4 of his predecessors refused to do. And in this case, Roosevelt justified it by saying that we need to have a cozy relationship with the Soviet Union because he said, I believe that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany is a danger, and we may need to have a friend in the Soviet Union if Hitler is as sinister a character as I think he might be. The other example from your book is Richard Nixon recognizing the People's Republic of China. There was a revolution in China in 1949 that brought the communist and Chairman Mao to power. The nationalists fled to Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek. And from 1949 until 1972, the United States officially recognized the Chinese government in Taiwan and refused to extend diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. Richard Nixon reversed our China policy, which had been in effect for 23 years. And under Richard Nixon, the United States recognized the the People's Republic of China. And ever since the Nixon administration, it is the mainland Chinese government that the United States has officially recognized.